Hello. Good evening and welcome to the Bangalore International Center. BIC, established in 2005, is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversation, exchange of ideas, arts, and culture. Today's program is Souza's Modernism, Decolonising Art History. FN Souza, one of the most provocative and unflinching voices in modern Indian art, challenged the conventions of both European and Indian art traditions. In her new book, FN Souza, The Archetypal Artist, academic and art critic Janeita Singh offers a deeply interdisciplinary reading of Souza's life and work, drawing on Jungian analysis, mythology, religion, and philosophy to examine how Souza confronted the collective unconscious through his art. In the session, she presents the key ideas from her book and then engages in a conversation with art historian Annapurna Garimella to explore how Souza's expressionism defied colonial and religious authority, reclaim the fragmented self, and question the ideological foundations of modernism. Together, they will reflect on the urgency of rethinking art history from decolonial and non-Western perspectives, and how Souza's work, with its blend of eroticism, irreverence, and rage, continues to challenge dominant narratives of aesthetics, identity, and power. The conversation will be followed by a Q&A session with the audience, so please hold on to your questions until then. To briefly introduce the speakers, author-researcher Janeita Singh is an academician turned literary art critic. Her book, FN Souza, The Archetypal Artist, published in April 2024, is the culmination of a 12-year research project. Her interdisciplinary research explores the loss and recovery of the self in post-colonial, post-war, and postmodernist times, with an emphasis on post-humanism. The book has been added to the reading collection at Tate Britain and the Getty Museum, LA. She is the writer of the film Ruptured Lines, based on FN Souza's art practice. She has also lent her critical voice to the film Father of Indian Modern Art. She curated talks on contemporary arts, Raza Dialogues, with the Raza Foundation Delhi and the Museum of Goa. She delivered presentations on the artist FN Souza at the Serendipity Arts Festival 2017-18. In 2009, she gave a talk on FN Souza at the exhibition Souza in the 40s at Sunap Paranta Center of the Arts. Dr. Annapurna Garimella is a designer and an art historian based in Bangalore. Having completed her BA from California State University, she went on to earn her MPhil and PhD from Columbia University, New York. She heads Jackfruit, an organization with a specialized portfolio of design, research, and curatorial projects. She is also the founder of Art Resources and Teaching Trust, a not-for-profit organization that runs a public art library, conducts independent research projects, and does teaching and advisement for college and university students and the general public. She was the former research editor and advisory board member for MARG Publications and is currently on the board of the Essence School of Art and Communication, University of Hyderabad. She is the author of the book, The Artful Life of R. Vijay, published by Serindia Publications in December 2015. Before we begin, I'd like to request the audience to switch off their mobile phones or put them on silent for the duration of the session. Please also refrain from any photography or videography of the art images in today's presentation. Without further ado, I'd now like to invite the speaker on to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Advaita, for that kind introduction. And good evening. Thank you for being here, the Bangalore International Center, and Mr. Vikram Bhatt for hosting me for this book event, and Dr. Annapurna Garimella, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. So the book FN Souza, The Archetypal Artist, began as a quest seeking answers to cultural constructs of life, body, and sexuality. Here I'd like to quote the American anthropologist Alfred Louis Kroeber, who came out with the idea of culture as superorganic, that human beings are born naked, but we add layers of culture, which then determine our behavioral patterns, our attitudes, and our decisions. In 2011, I was grappling with the remnants of my wounded post-colonial psyche, akin to Ashish Nandi's book, The Loss and Recovery of the Self. That is, that colonization had fractured the psyche of the colonialist as well as the colonized, and it had long-lasting repercussions. Also highlighted in George Orwell's The Burmese Days, where shooting of the elephant has become an oft-repeated example. The conditioned and structured lives of men and women in society troubled me. The hypermasculinity propagated by nationalism had led to constricted women journeys, which affected me and my first family directly. I wanted to see my dwindled and denuded, widowed mother for the primordial goddess that she is. The state and religious machinery thwarted attempts at autonomy at every step. The rationalism of enlightenment and had marginalized alternative epistemic knowledge systems, transpersonal psychology, and a free human consciousness was not recognized and given value. The nexus of capitalism, bureaucracy, and patriarchy was imposing and claustrophobic, leaving little room for creativity and imagination. The Apollonian Dionysian duality was polarized towards one extremity. East and West had been at loggerheads for centuries. A serious engagement with Souza's art began in context of a search for sovereignty, and the connect was visceral, thought-provoking, and cathartic. I would say that this also came about because by then I had been embedded in Carl Jung psychology for over a decade, and I began perceiving new insights in Souza's body of work. Shadows and archetypes danced on his canvas. Souza mined images from his personal unconscious, overlaying a grid of the collective unconscious. Everything that we as a society had suppressed, marginalized, or rejected stood glorified on his canvas. Souza's modernity mirrored a wounded psyche as he grappled with post-war, post-colonial, and post-enlightenment paradigms. I approached Souza as an archetypal artist, a take from Jungian psychology. The fascination lies with the artist who obeys alien impulses, welding him like a marionette. Souza was a compulsive artist. Art is as important as bread. And we're all familiar with this anecdote that he arrived in London and he had just 15 pounds in his pocket. And the very first day, he goes and spends 10 pounds on paints and other painting material. And then he's just left with 5 pounds for boarding, lodging, and food. According to Jung, along with our immediate consciousness, which is of a more personal nature, there exists a second psychic system, which is impersonal, collective, and universal in nature. The collective unconscious, which is identical in all humans, and it is inherited. And whoever speaks in primordial language, whoever speaks in primordial images speaks with 1,000 voices. He enthralls and overpowers the world with the spiritual task, affecting epos, said Carl Jung. In other words, when the conscious life of a society becomes one-sided or it acquires a false attitude, the images from the unconscious instinctively rise to the surface in dreams and visions of artists. And society as a whole must allow itself to be fully engaged in the work of artists to be transformed and renewed. A quote from Carl Jung, Spirit of Man in Art and Literature. The archetypal artist framework also allowed me to understand Souza not just as a product of his time, but as someone grappling with forces, religious, erotic, and social, that his unconscious led him to, that are much older and deeper than modernity itself. And now I shall go on to a slideshow. By focusing on what to acknowledge in world art, a tyranny in art practice, an insidious control was formulated in the modern era. Modernism was defined in straitened terms, othering cultures, sexuality, the question of evil, and the holistic existence of dualities. And Souza is born in 1924 in Goa. He grows up in Goa and Bombay. Yeah? And 1 year into World War II, that's in 1940, a 16-year-old young artist began putting out images on his canvas. And these were those othered themes to do with sexuality, the question of evil, and the holistic existence of dualities. A look back at Souza as a young artist introduces society to a classy and subversive art undertaken with keen sensitivity and empathy, which disrupts many a myth perpetuated by the powerful West. Through his art, Souza seems to have succeeded in bringing the subaltern into their own, who stand tall, naked, and proud, resplendent in their history, culture, and heritage. Souza continued to fold the taboo in his art through a play of what was permitted in society and that which was suppressed and forbidden. Souza's entire body of work is set out as an exercise in shadow work of the collective human consciousness. I believe the idea behind his portrayal is that if we can see it, we can then begin to establish a conscious relationship to it. As a boy, I had to attend school. We had to learn by rote, a wretched system of education established by the British in India. I tried to escape it for more than 10 juvenile years of my life, often successfully by playing truant day after day or by malingering. So these are his words from his autobiography, Words and Lines. I was brought up to believe that Hindu sculpture and Mughal paintings were graven images of the heathen. I had to find out everything for myself, the history of Chinese, African, Persian, and Indian art. I acquired knowledge of the Renaissance, the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists, the Fauves, and the Cubists. To comprehend and appreciate modern paintings, one must know one's way in the world of art history from Praxiteles to Picasso, from Han to Manchu dynasty, and from Mohenjo-daro to Francis Newton. A quote by Souza in his exhibition catalogue, Bombay Art Society, November 1948. And this quote became an inspiration for me. So I traced the entire lineage of the female nude from Praxiteles to Picasso, and then from Mohenjo-daro to Francis Newton. And these became headings of the titles in my book. The first female nude in art history. To comprehend Souza's female nude, we have to go back to the story of the first female nude sculpture created in art history in the Greek classical period. It is here that we must seek constructions which provide the background for the advent of nudity into mainstream art culture. Praxiteles, the great sculptor in the Greek classical period, broke a 300-year-old tradition when he carved Aphrodite of Knidos in the nude. Before that, female forms known as kors in the Egyptian civilization and the Greek were always sculpted, fully attired. To be cast nude in marble or bronze was the exclusive privilege of the heroic male, Kuroi, the youthful, athletic, idealized masculine body. Here it's very important to understand the concept of sophrosiny in Greek culture, which meant prudence, temperance, and soundness of mind, indoctrinated into the male from within, and was the sole criterion of male supremacy. But woman as a species was frequently said to lack this ordering principle of sophrosiny. As opposed to women then, men were considered beautiful, internal organic wholes and aesthetes of control and refinement. Anne Carson's brilliant scholarship on Greek art and culture sheds light on the idea of sophrosiny and in connection to the female body. Aristotle makes clear that for the man, sophrosiny is rational self-control and resistance to excess. But for the woman, it is dutifulness and obedience and consists in submitting herself to the control of others. Women had to be controlled from outside, elaborates Carson. Women were regarded as polluted beings and polluting agents in society. They were anomalous beings, so-called imperfect men, as individuals themselves, formless characters without firm control of personal boundaries. A civilization that does not take adequate measure to control the leakage of its women could be said to be sailing in a sea of life in a Malian boat, a boat full of holes, a civilization condemned to chaos. Because they were social entities, they were units of danger moving across boundaries of family and house and marriage, prostitution, and adultery. As psychological entities, they were thought to be unstable, compounds of deceit and desire, and prone to leakage. So when Praxiteles broke a 300-year-old tradition and carved Aphrodite of Knidos in the nude, but very surreptitiously, he embellished her with qualities of modesty, sin, and shame. So Aphrodite of Knidos, she stands with her head turned to one side and her hands covering her body parts. That what is covered is hidden, and which gives rise to the outside gaze, the voyeur who wants to know what is hidden, resulting in desirability and eroticism. In a sense, this desirable woman embedded in the Nydia was recreated numerous times by major figures in history. It set in motion an adulation of female nudity over male form, which continued for 2,500 years. Botticelli, the same Venus Pudica pose. Titian, Velasquez, Goya. Manet may have morphed the gaze, but the body remained compromised. Goga transposed it on a Polynesian woman, but the body remained the same. Cleopatra was always dogged by the dichotomy of being an able administrator and a temptress, but she was always portrayed with an asp applied to her breast, pushing the narrative to being a temptress. So this is how the female nude in art history arrived at the turn of the modern era. Now, Indian artists like M.V. Dhurendra, Shashi Hesh, even when there were no nude models available in the JJ School of Art, they drew and painted women in the nude on their canvas. But there was a difference. With the mother goddess following in every other Hindu home in India, these women on these artists' canvases were unashamed, striking, and powerful. But nobody did what Souza did. He just pinpointed the nail on the head and hammered it in. So I love this particular photograph of Souza. He's 17 years old in 1941. Stands with his hand akimbo, It's like, oh, I know it all. Yeah, I've understood this whole conditioning, this whole thing which has happened to us. And I'm going to take on the art world. So there's that fierceness and that rebellion. So if he came out with emancipated figures on his canvas at the age of 16, 17, that means the churning process in his psyche began when he was 12, 13 years old. So I like this particular artwork of his. Female standing nude, 1941, when he was 17 years old. She's unapologetic and she stands matter of fact. She's completely at home in her body, a free woman directed exclusively by her ego, twined with her inner self. An autonomous being free to make her own choices regarding her identity and sexuality. She owns every part of her body, her anatomy and physiology, and there's nothing outside herself. She privileges her intellect, that is intuition, and her instincts, and sexual freewheeling know-how over sexual ignorance and exploitation. And she presents a unique model of the new woman with a novel sexual code, a new human consciousness that views sexuality and desire with respect, equality, and consent, and arrives at beauty and joy. The nude is now the egoist. And now she can stand shoulder to shoulder with the Kuroi of the Greek classical period. Souza's female nude is the denied feminine principle that surfaced from his unconscious. And that's why I've called him an archetypal artist. And these images came up from his personal unconscious, overlaying a grid of the collective unconscious. He developed the theme of the female nude throughout his life with panache. His preoccupation with the female nude was fetishized and questioned. The viewer groomed a voyeur on 3 millennia patriarchal art where female sexuality served man's fantasy, and the F word did not get it. In fact, they were repelled by Souza's explicit portraiture of female sexuality, a right to her egoist self. But an engagement with Souza's art makes the viewer become comfortable with the esoteric feminine energy and form. Women standing on his canvases are substantial and formidable. And surprisingly, not one of them is shy, skinny, shamefaced, self-effacing, self-conscious, shrinking, or sheepish. They were definitely more inclined towards sculptures of Indian temple art, but with a distinctive modernist twist. So here I've juxtaposed two of Souza's works with the Venus of Willendorf, the 9-inch statue, which was unearthed from southern Austria, and it's a 30,000-year-old. And the Sheila Nagig rock-cut carvings found at the entrance of churches and walls of cathedrals, most prevalent in Ireland, England, and France and Spain. Lotus-headed Lajja Gauri, 6th century Madhya Pradesh, and Souza's Lajja Gauri, again with a very strong modernist signature. And this is all part of his early art. Now moving on from the denied feminine principle to the question of evil, Souza, the champion of the grotesque, inspires horror, elation, wonder, and shock with his grotesque imagery. Souza celebrates bad taste and in the process embraces the real, which leads to jouissance. The figures in the grotesque paintings may appear revolting and disgusting, But by suspending rules and customs, Souza portrays the interiority of the human psyche. He revels in conjuring up a carnival of our basic urges and desires, that which is hidden and repressed, the innate drive of maybe jealousy, hatred, maybe aggression in another human being, or greed, or violence, or envy. Yeah? He glorifies and projects on the outside and thus deforming the external to a grotesque configuration. I believe the idea behind his portrayal is that if we can see it, we can then begin to establish a conscious relationship to it. Maybe mitigate it so that it doesn't play out in harmful ways. A very famous work by Souza, Death of Pope. So Pope is like a skeleton here. So he's lost his grandiosity, fang-like fingers and teeth, a pointy nose. And then there are these group of men around him, maybe saying the last rites and the prayers, but they're whisperings of power and succession. The most powerful satire, and he did not part with this painting. It's part of his early work, and he didn't part with it. He sold it only in the US when he was undergoing great financial crisis. So here he juxtaposes the barbaric splendor of a Baroque church in Goa with the tableau of Golgotha, the apathy and cruelty of the tableau of Golgotha, in a way morphing it a gluttonous celebration of wealth bathed in red. So he's brought in techniques from the Fauves and the miniature artists and also the Byzantine art, that is the stained glass windows of churches in Goa, right? It's a beautiful, beautiful painting. Duality, polarities in their fiery quality. Souza had this knack of bringing the polarities onto one canvas. He just put them together. Yeah? If we can stay with the tension of opposites long enough, sustain it, be true to it, so that your body becomes a crucible, we can sometimes become vessels within which the divine opposites come together and give birth to a new reality. A quote from Jungian psychology, and this painting is Eros and Thanatos. I'm just showing you one here because we are limited by time, but then there's a beautiful one which he did of Christ, in which he's made him look like an innocent child, and the other side it's wisdom, which is a part of my book. And then there's another one, East and West encounter. There's another one which is to do with chaste and lustfulness. There are a whole lot of themes, and yeah, you must look at the images. The Head series of Souza runs parallel to his female nude. He was as prolific there as he was with the female nude. And I argue in my book that he was seeking a different consciousness, alternative ways of being. And his self-portraits are to do with introspection and growth, which is an overall theme in Jungian psychology again, to do with individuation. He began with women heads, women looking intelligent and pensive and contemplative. So though he was born a Catholic, he would go to these temple festivals, the Jatra, and watch the Devdasis dancing and singing to the legends of Kali and Durga. And also there were these warrior queens in the neighboring state of Karnataka, Abaka Mahadevi, Kittur Chinnamma, who had held the Portuguese and the British at bay for decades and not allowed them to invade their kingdoms. Their stories had been adapted by the Yakshagana plays, which is a pilgrimage traveling theater, and we traveled all along the Konkan coast, and he would have watched those stories. And so as a young boy studying, he came out with these women heads. The very few artists who've begun with women heads. He came to the body later. And so these women heads, the one I've shown below right here, is quite remarkable. My pointer, I think it's there. And then a second phase of Souza's psychic churning came about in the 1960s. Thank you so much. In the 1960s, at that time, the atomic bomb and space explorations loomed at the height of Cold War. The heightened border tensions and electoral jingoism made it imperative that the human collective no longer ignore man's psyche. More than nuclear war itself, it was the human psyche that had become the dreaded threat to human existence. Souza's artwork from the 60s onwards thrusts hard towards the goal of renewed patterns of thought, alternative ways of being, heralding evolved mindsets with a renewal of the collective consciousness. Study of Souza heads in light of the philosophy of Jean Gebser, Carl Jung, Aurobindo Ghosh, and Teilhard Chardin becomes very interesting. So maybe we'll do another PowerPoint only on the heads next time. So these are all the works that were shown. So now I think we are set to have a conversation. Yeah? So, yeah. So I'll use the pointer, I'll sit with you, and I'll use that. So I don't need to, yeah.
Testing.
Hello? I think mine is not on.
It's on, she's saying. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me join you in this conversation, and thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to the BIC for inviting me and talking about an under-discussed artist. I think Souza is so completely under-discussed. Everybody's terrified of him, especially today. Terrified of him. And he was terrifying, I think, in certain ways. He didn't care. I've had the privilege of reading some of his letters to people like Akbar Padamsee, to Manu Parekh, and to Raza, and to other people. And he was just, that was a different era. I mean, people really cared about their work and cared about writing and talking to each other about their work. And it makes it very, very powerful to sit here in 2025 and discuss an artist whose work still terrifies people. People buy Souza's art for investment, but they don't display it. Because how do you show Souza's art if you want to be polite? And we're an incredibly repressed country. And we're really concerned about politeness in that way that's completely impolite and uncaring. So I'm happy to have this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for, so I have a series of questions that have emerged from our conversations before this event, and also from watching you. I'm sorry, I'll be good. I'll be good. This is a little hard, so a little phallic, if you ask me. But okay. I will ask you some questions based on our conversations before, but also from what I've been seeing on the screen as you've been talking and what have emerged. She asked me if I had a set of questions, and I said, I think we've talked enough, but I'd rather keep things a little bit fresh and not have a canned set of questions, because in the spirit of Souza, let's shock ourselves by seeing where our consciousness goes. And that's the fun of a conversation, where things go. And so let me just begin by the idea, what needs to be decolonized about the art history of Souza? Let's start with the question there, because it comes from the title of your talk.
So, like, maybe
First,
we
I
could
think
begin with...
maybe you could even just begin, if you don't mind me interrupting, I'm sorry, by just sharing what your idea of decolonization is, so that anybody, I mean, there's so many theories of decolonization in political science, in sociology, in literature, in art history, subaltern studies, so many things. So maybe what is your ground for decolonization?
So, like, I began my talk with the thought, like, Ashish Nandi's book, Lost and Recovery of the Self, was something that I really connected to. And I think it is also in the context of my own recovery, in a way, and a self-healing journey. And I was grappling with the remnants of my wounded post-colonial psyche, yes? And
can you give us an example of what you mean by wound?
Wound.
Without I don't want to invade your private space, but what do you mean by a wound?
So a wound would be like, I did quote about my mother, that, you know, the hyper-masculinity propagated by nationalism had led to constricted women journeys. And my mother became a widow in 85, yeah? And she's lived alone all this while, but it's like how and what she went through in that journey as a widow of her relationship to society is one side, but also her own family, of how widows are treated in their own families. And she comes from quite an elite family, yeah? Like, she was born in Burma. Her grandfather was a civil surgeon at the Rangoon General Hospital. She comes from a well-to-do family. But it's like, and I, as a growing girl, I watched that whole story of how her family related to her as a woman and a widow. Yes? So I think that was a big wound which resided in my psyche for long, long years. And when I just began looking at Souza's art, I'd seen it many times before, but it was always as a PAG artist, as a group. But in context of the self-healing journey, I'm in a chaotic, confused state. And I'm reading art, and I'm reading literature, and also religious scriptures, and I'm looking at Souza's art. So in context of the self-healing journey, when I looked at his art, and I thought, look at these women standing on his canvases. So unapologetic, so owning themselves, so reclaiming their cosmic design. Yeah? And like, they become the first citizens of this world through just standing. They're just standing, not doing anything. Yes? And also I would like to put out here that Souza's women, the female nude, is always carved in a frontal position. Yeah? That is the Kayot Sarga. Comes from the Chitra Sutra, yeah? Which is the Vishnu Dharmotara Purana. These are these 8 chapters of Chitra Sutra, which are on Indian painting. And Kayot Sarga comes from the cosmology of Jainism and Buddhism, which means a liberated being, cool passivity. Something which stands there, the Buddha, who's managed and controlled internally. He's held by his inner strength. So his women standing, Souza's women standing, they are not like, in our miniature paintings, we have 3/4 profile. And that lends restlessness and lends movement. But here, these women are just, so they're so Sophrosine.
Self-contained.
Sophrosine, which was the Greek idea of women being, lacking soundness of mind and prudence and temperance and so on. This is the exact opposite vocabulary that he is scripting. So when I looked at those women, like my first interlude, let me tell you that. I just walked into a gallery and it was like I saw the golden nude through the tinted glass of the window gallery. And it was weird. I thought, like, that's me striking a nonchalant pose on the canvas, where one would have expected the Venus Pudica types with a perpetual blush marking her countenance, or the more prevalent spread-eagled, spineless supine she form. But this was different. And I felt that I'd never seen, these kind of women in art histories, in Western art history. So here we can also go to John Berger, Ways of Seeing, yeah? And the male gaze and objectification of women in the Western art history, especially the nude genre. And also there's a very contemporary writer, Sri Hastvadat. The title of her book is Women Looking at Men Looking at Women. Yeah? And these are essays on art, mind, and sex. And she says that the history of Western art is full of women lying around naked for the erotic consumption by men. Aren't these women unthreatening? Aren't they unthreatening? She says, right? But Souza's women are not lying around. They're like this. They're standing. They're looking you. They look at you, straight and strong. They meet your gaze. And they're held so strong within their own self. So I think the wounding in my psyche, and then I looked at these women, and it just came together for me. And I thought, Souza's work is shadow work of the collective human consciousness. Because women's journeys have been the same everywhere, in every corner of the world. The degree varies. But we are not the first citizens of the world anywhere.
So, when I hear this answer that you've given me to my question, I think that this is a very idiosyncratic book, which is a combination of exploring the Souza archive, exploring the formation of female subjectivity in post-colonial South Asia, because you have this lovely and complex background between Burma and Rawalpindi and Goa, and of course circulating through metropolitan India, wherever you've talked about your defense background and all that kind of stuff, right? So do you want your book to be seen as art history? Do you want it to be seen as a psychoanalytic study of an artist who paints women on canvases? When you imagine an artist painting on a canvas, he's standing straight or sitting, and the woman that's on the canvas is also standing straight. In some sense, he's mirroring her, and she's mirroring him in posture as the painting emerges on the canvas and as his idea emerges out of him onto the canvas. So is this a psychoanalytic study in some sense of that process? Because you in your book, you do talk quite a bit about Jung, and even in your presentation, you've talked about shadow work, you've talked about collective consciousness. Or do you see this as a completely new genre of writing in which, just like he was an autodidact, you also had to become an autodidact to deal with the questions that were coming up inside of you? It's a complex question, but I think you can handle it.
It's refreshing to hear what you have to say. Yeah, it's bringing maybe new thoughts and insights into my mind, hearing you speak. Yeah, your reading of my book. I'm convinced about the psychoanalytical, though I haven't mentioned Sudhir Kakkar in my book. Right. But Souza's relationship with his own mother and my relationship with my mother. Yeah. men and boys in India, what Sudhir Sakakar writes, is a fixation on the mother, you know, like the archetypal woman, the mother, feminine woman, yeah. That was also...
Is that a comfortable thing to have, to be fixated on your mother?
It's a very complicated thing. It's
like
a
you to
very,
talk
very,
about that.
very deep and complicated, but there's a lot of shadow there. And
Can you talk about what you mean by shadow? I'm just prompting so that other people can access that word.
like my mother triggered me a lot in my life, in my growing up years and later. And Souza's mother triggered him because when he looked at her, it was like this voluptuous woman, right? And also she was very unpredictable because she was a widow, so she was given to moodiness at times, yes? And so I think he had a very complex relationship with his mother, which I have unraveled and tried to understand through Sudhir Kakkar's writing. His Inner Child, the book that he's written, and then Intimate Relations, which is to do with the Kama Sutra, right. Yes? And the mother complex, we could say. But I think the mother complex is a treasure house. It corners you. It really is very depressing because it's a shadow, right? And it triggers you and provokes you. But when you go on that self-healing journey to put that right, your relationship with your mother, whether it could be your daughter or son, a lot of unraveling happens. And
was Souza your partner in that unraveling?
No, I always think of Souza as my father.
Ah.
And I'm best friends with his daughters.
Ah.
Yeah, and yes, good. Souza's relationship with his daughters, because I've had these long conversations with them and how much they've been traumatized because of his presence in their life. It was another added chapter to the other two relations that I spoke about before. Me and my mother, Souza and his mother.
I think the Indian art world is traumatized a little bit by Souza. In a good way, but also in a scary way.
There's a quote which says that, you know, artists are like genius artists, they're like thunderstorms, you know. They go against the wind, terrify everybody, and they cleanse the air. They cleanse the air. Yeah, so he settled a lot of shadows in our collective human consciousness. He cleansed the air that way. And he's healing. There's one sentence I spoke which I said, the connect was visceral, thought-provoking, and cathartic.
So you have Ashish Nandi, who's also of a psychoanalytic bent, deeply.
True.
And you have Sudhir Kakkar, whose work is just brilliant. He makes this amazing bridge between Freudian psychoanalysis and how to think about the way that the elite Hindu tradition of yoga and purushartha position chitta, consciousness, and the mind, and a kind of effulgence where you absorb everything. There's less, that's the ideal state. And then you have someone like Jung. So these are several different psychoanalytic approaches. How did you balance all of this when you're coming towards Souza? And Souza himself is analyzing himself all the time. I read in the context of your book, Words and Lines, for the first time. I read quotes of it, but I never read the whole book. And I won't say I read the whole book this time either, but I read a lot of that book. Because it's very repetitive, actually. It's like he's circling in the same thoughts again and again and again and again. And I wonder, because, well, I'll come to that in a second. Please address this question. There are competing, collaborating psychoanalytics going on. And how did you, as a person, wanting to heal yourself, wanting to engage with this artist who's done some important work for you, and then bringing it together in such a way that you're bringing it to us?
I would say, Annapurna, you're no less than Souza.
I'm no less than Souza. Ooh.
She didn't give me any structured questions. And now see, one question after another. All right, so fine.
But
So
just
I
take
would
it the way you
yeah,
want to
yeah,
take
yeah,
it.
Yeah, I'm
Please.
enjoying it. Yeah.
Oh, good.
So,
You're no
Sorry.
less than me then.
I'm not holding the mic. He cannot hear me. All right. Sudhir Kakkar goes with Freud and Erikson, Milton Erikson. And nothing to do with Carl Jung. He doesn't really. But there are overlappings with Carl Jung. If you study Carl Jung's psychology, you'll find an overlapping with Sudhir Kakkar's psychology. That's how it happened.
Interested in myth.
They're interested in myth, culture, religion, of how that impacts a human being.
Right.
Yeah? So there's that commonality. Freud and I did toy with Freud for some time. Yeah? But the Freud is the founder of psychoanalysis, but he spoke about the unconscious, the personal unconscious, which he said has repressed memories, childhood trauma, and desires which are repressed. Yeah? That's his unconscious. But Carl Jung comes out with the concept of unconscious. He says there's a collective unconscious, which is a completely new idea. Right? And this collective unconscious undergirds the personal unconscious of every person. And this collective unconscious is shared by whole of humanity. Every individual has this. But every individual does not have the aptitude, the capacity to tap into that unconscious.
But it's still circulating.
But it's there in his psyche. In the psychic system, it's there. It's of a universal, impersonal, collective kind. And we're all born with it. It contains the mythology of the human story from all parts of the world, right? It has archetypes, shadows of the collective human consciousness. Yes? It has the self. It has the ego and self axis. So when Carl Jung speaks about growth and evolution, it's like the ego travels more and more towards the self. Yeah? So that was Carl Jung. Now, libido. All three people speak of libido. That's how it came together for me. Freud said libido is the sexual and aggressive instincts in the unconscious by which we are driven, the neurosis of our childhood trauma and repressed desires. Yeah? So Freud is talking about individual pathology and how to make that right through dream analysis, free transference, and so on. Yeah? Carl Jung, he speaks about collective unconscious. For him, libido is not sexual. It has a much wider connotation. For him, libido is partly sexual, but it's life energy. It's the life force, what we see, what Stella Kremrich speaks about, pulsating to the tips of our fingers and toes in sculptures of India. That's how they are modeled, right? And this one just opened up the whole floodgate for me. It's then you go to Henry Bergson, vitality, and deluge morph that Bergson's vitality into Elan vital. And then you have Schopenhauer, the unconscious will, what drives us. And in Sanskrit, it's called ayus, the life principle again in Sanskrit. Yes? And then there's another one which I've left out is libido for Carl Jung. So it's this encompassing wide, it has a very wide lens. And this libido is to do with your creativity, your imagination, your purpose in life. Then there's a quote by Souza, and he said, "My painting doesn't come from my love or my hatred, it comes from my libido." And this libido is the energy which I get from nature. And it's the same whether I'm eating, I'm painting, I'm driving, I'm fornicating. The energy is the same. It's like changing gears in a car. is a quote by Souza. So he said this. And so this definition, what Souza arrived at, is what Carl Jung is saying. Yeah? What Spinoza is saying, conatus, that every living being has this inclination to exist and to enhance. So Carl Jung psychology is about evolution of consciousness through culture, through symbolism of culture, spirituality. Yeah? So it brings in individuation, whereas Freud is very limited and myopic. That's more to do with biochemicals and with pathology. So then I left out Freud completely. And I went with Carl Jung, because in a way he was saying something what Souza was quoting and saying. And Souza wasn't a psychologist, but he'd arrived upon this knowledge. I would say, now if I take Erikson, Milton Erickson's psychology is that development of the human doesn't stop when you become of age, adolescence, you become an adult, and you have a career and a job and you're married. No. Your evolution is going to go through. Then there's a midlife crisis, and then there is this 50s and 60s, and then 80s, 90s. He's got all these stages, Milton Erickson he's got, which is what Carl Jung is saying, is that we keep on evolving and growing if we want to, if we have that kind of an aptitude. And impetus for growth comes from spirituality. Spirituality is a very important part of Carl Jung psychology. Whereas Freud was said, it's all humbug. It's like spirituality and religion is coping mechanisms for anxiety. And he left it there. But Carl Jung, why he did not publish his books, and the Red Book came out only in 2008. Yeah, why he didn't? Because he thought that I belong to this Western world, and that's to do with empirical knowledge, something that has to be proved, like how we prove things in a court case. If there is no evidence, and he had gone into mysticism, into mythology, Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung are shaking hands all the time. So they are into all this. And Carl Jung could not publish his books because he thought he'll no longer be regarded as a scientist. And he didn't want that to happen in his lifetime. So his books remained and his writings remained in wraps, because he didn't want to be called a mystic. It's only now that Carl Jung psychology is a rage in America. Like, he's a Swiss psychiatrist, but now it's a rage in America, it's in South Africa, it's in Australia.
We have a very
it's
big
like
movement here in Bangalore.
Yeah, that's what. It's
Right.
like we have in fact, I had invited the Bangalore
Kusum.
Society of Analytics Psychology. So yeah, you see, like there are these intersections.
So I'm going to interrupt you
Yeah,
here. So
yeah.
if you have your mother, who's a prompt, we all need our masala to become human beings, right? So she's one part of the masala. You have Souza is your father. Are Kakar and Nandi like your siblings because of their...
Oh my God, like this is now going into...
No, because this is so deep in your work. As you use Souza and allow Souza to enter
Yeah,
you.
they help me. Yeah, so we could say they are my resources or my colleagues.
Please, could you use your mic?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Resources or
Yeah.
my colleagues, yeah. Who were all, who like I met Sudhir Kakkar, we are of the same times.
He recently passed away.
Yeah, he recently passed away. So yeah, we belong to the same times, and yeah. Yeah, that brings me to another belief that I, quickly came to have after my research began, is that I did mention to you that a particular time or an epoch has an energy, and people living in different corners of the world, they might not have met each other physically, but they're all working in their own spheres and vocation, but they're working towards that energy. So Carl Jung and Souza never met each other. And there's nothing to suggest that he even read Jung. But when you read Carl Jung theory and philosophy, and then you look at Souza's canvases and you think, oh, like he was putting it out in a visual imagery, what he's doing in writing.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit.
Yeah, and Didi Kosambi was another one. Yeah.
Shift gears because though we didn't formulate questions, we did make some points. So
Yeah.
we've covered,
Yeah,
we did cover one aspect.
Yeah.
So the next thing I'd like to put in front of you is, as I've read your book, but also Souza's own book, is he talks about himself as this very fragile person when he was young, physically unwell, economically vulnerable. Of course, very rich in the resources he saw in Bombay, very rich in the resources he had in Goa, full of masala from the family and from society. So there's a lot of material for him. Yeah. And then what you see is the fulcrum being his mother, as you've already pointed out, that she becomes in some sense the thing that helps him move through all of these things in pivots and stuff like that. So, and then in there you mention, and he of course mentions in words and lines about mothers and goddesses and the Kalavantins, the Devadasis of Goa that he happened to see during festivals and whatnot. And the strong women, as you mentioned in your talk, and also in your, also he mentioned, and you mentioned of Onake Obbava and Rani Abbaka and Kittur Chennamma, all these amazing figures from Karnataka, and we're a little sub-nationalist today, but it wasn't like that before. So he had access to all of this stuff. How do you see, and he had, one thing he seems to have always had is tremendous belief in his own artistry. That's a kind of unshakable faith he has. And I've read his letters, and he's so sure, almost to the point of it being a curse on him, to not have a modicum of self-doubt, which is sometimes a little bit hubris. I don't know if it's hubris, but self-doubt can be very productive sometimes. It's pretty productive. And Geeta Kapoor gets at this in her essay on him in her 1979 book, Six Contemporary Indian Artists, where she challenges him very deeply and says that he's kind of frozen in time. But we'll get to that later. First, let's get to this part. How does all this stuff come together? His vulnerability, his incredible resources, his encounters and desire. I think there's fundamental desire for women to be strong. And that is in no way in conflict with his promiscuity, sexual promiscuity, though he was incredibly monogamous to the idea of woman. Finally, his like sort of the type of women that he painted, because while you mention the fact that he's unique in the way though you find him unique in the way he shows women, but somebody who was deeply interested in showing women in a way that was completely different from other artists was Amrita Shergill. The elephant in the room is Amrita Shergill. And as a woman artist, as a person very openly grappling with this idea of darkness and fair skin, fairness, darkness and fairness on the body of the woman, I'd like you to just contemplate with us a little bit of how you think about all of this. Because somewhere in there, I think in his text, he's kind of dismissive of Shergill.
He is.
So could you just enlighten us, even if you have problems with his dismissiveness of Shergill, I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, I think that came from him being, like you said, he was very, very sure of himself. Like it's said that he would maybe sometimes sit like in a party or something, he'd just take himself to a little side and he'd sit on a plonk himself and he'd start drawing and painting. And once he's put something on the paper that he's drawing and painting, he'd never ever correct that or change that in any way. It's like if a line's there, it's there. And it seems that's what his family says and his friends say, that that's true, that he never changed or tweaked anything. When you live with that kind of clarity and vision, I think it does something to your psyche. And over a period of time, it's like you're so sure of yourself.
So does clarity and vision and the lack of self-doubt sometimes become stubbornness?
Stubbornness. I'll just digress a little from
Yes,
here,
please,
and I
please.
will say that all these elements that you brought together and you enumerated, I would say that that's what made me celebrate beauty of human beings. That human beings are so complex. And Souza is a wonderful example of complexity. Yeah, his personal life, we all know, he was so troubled. Yeah, very conflicted. His own family hates him and loves him. And on the other hand, that the kind of art that he came about on his canvas, he's a very, very complex character, and I thought that is where beauty resides.
So you see that
The conundrums. So when you say he's vulnerable, but he's also strong and stubborn. So this conundrum is what makes a human being. He may be like the best of best, but to one person, and the other person, it's its shadow comes out when he's interacting with that other person. So this person says, oh, he's a terror, like he's a demon. And for the other one, he's an angel. So these are two sides to his own personality, which writers have.
a lot of artists like Manu Parekh, who have spent a lot of time talking, really admire his.
Manu Parekh,
really admires his kind of purpose, intentional commitment to his own artistic passion.
But then that's why I've called him an archetypal artist. He was a compulsive artist. He was, under the dominance of these alien impulses which moved him like a marionette, is what I quoted. And that's where he comes together with Carl Jung.
And
Carl Jung's, according to Carl Jung, people are born with this automated creative complex. And they are not free in the sense that they are directed by that force all the time. And they give up their whole life in service to that force. And that's why their own lives are so tortured and troubled and conflicted.
But then I'll come back to what
it's the unconscious. Yeah.
But then I'll come back to your journey with Souza. You came to Souza to become free in some sense.
Yeah. See,
that's a very complex.
Search for sovereignty.
That's a very complex connection. No?
True. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So let me come to. Should we open it up to the audience, or should I ask a couple of more questions? How are we doing here?
We could go with a few images.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Why don't you go for images, and let's see.
Yeah, and maybe the audience can also ask them. So this is the first image we have. I think we've talked about Jung and Freud. This is something that I.
You need to talk in the microphone because it's hard to hear.
So this was the image that I selected for some kind of a discussion around Jung and Freud, like the psychoanalytical take and his grotesque art of why he made these kind of heads, and he props up the executives and then strips them down. So subverting of order and authority and hierarchy and also propriety and formality. He was like, I think he just got a kick out of this. He just enjoyed doing this so much. And he used to call them stuffed shirts. Yeah, he would ridicule them no end. Yeah. So this is a painting which is the Vedas, which is a very common theme and has been rendered by many artists in European countries also, the European masters. And so I've just I'll show you all the three images, and you could do a comparative study. So this is by Souza, Vedas, and it's a Goan landscape at the background. This is by Souza, the large Vedas by Souza. This is again, on the river side, there are these women grooming themselves. Same theme. And this is by Matisse. La Bona
What do you
da
see as the
Viva.
difference of that Souza brings to the theme?
Yeah.
Would you like to talk a little bit about that? If you could go back to that and...
So now that we've seen all of them, so the radical facet I would say about Souza's work is the ease of the woman. All the women here are so at home in their bodies. So their corporeality does not in a way parlay into vulgarity or voyeurism. They're not self-conscious. They're not, bending or covering or hiding themselves. They stand with their children, one with the landscape behind them, in a way merging with the instinctual properties of nature, essentially free. But if we look at the other two paintings, see all the women, the bodies, they're all bending. They're not all right. They're not like comfortable with themselves, showing themselves. They're hiding, they're ashamed maybe. Though it's a beautiful composition, triangular. And this is more like a dream fantasy, like a sexualized fantasy
like a
that we
harem.
meet in a dream sequence. Yeah, these are provocative Venus pudica female forms that you meet in a dream, in a mythic scape. So very befitting the consciousness of the aftermath of the Victorian era, but a far cry from the self-possessed real women of Souza's painting. What would you say? Any comment or question? So I've done this comparative study in my book. There's one essay which deals with this. And also, Annapurna, we must mention the Vedas from the Krishna Leela Vastraharan scene, which was, there was this proliferation of images at the turn of the 20th century because there was engraving and oleography and lithography, photography, all that had come into. And so there was mass production of images. So we had calendar art, we had postcards, we had images on matchboxes, those little labels, as also cigarette packets. And Krishna Leela, Krishna's dalliance, was a favorite topic. And I think it came from the painting of a Nathwara artist, the Vastraharan scene, which was replicated over and over in imagery, in the mass production of images. And Souza, we all grew up with that image. Yeah, it's part of our culture. Yeah, and Souza, of course, like he was an artist, so how he perceived that and what he took away from that and then adapted, and he comes out with his Vedas. So I put that also in my essay. Yes.
Yeah, so it's not a new question. Basically, the ma'am was asking how Souza was very dismissive of Shergill. I think yeah.
So you want...
Yeah, I mean, why he was dismissive about her art and all. I mean, this is the first time I actually got to know this, so I'm really interested to know that factor that ma'am said in her last question, the last point she... Yeah.
He was dismissive. Right? We cannot dismiss that. But like why he was, or like what was his reasons, I wouldn't really be able to, do justice to that answer. Yeah.
It's, I think, about the surety that you said.
Yeah, of course.
The surety and the clarity.
That had a part to play. Yeah, that had a part to play.
He was in general quite dismissive of many people.
Of many
it's a
people, but then he also celebrated a lot of people, like all the European masters like Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso, he also celebrated his own contemporaries, Hussein, Raza. Yeah. He had wonderful relationship with all these artists, But even that was something
he had strong opinions.
Yeah.
And I think this is a good topic for research. Maybe you'll do it.
This is the first time I got to know and
But that's true. Yeah, he was. Yeah.
It's just very interesting. If I can just move away from the visuals here. One was this whole question of Jung, and the question that was back of my mind was meeting Souza. They never met. But before the Campbell encounter, actually Jung had met Zimmer in Europe, and when he did visit, Jung did visit India, Zimmer had asked him, in particular, the question of spiritualism that you mentioned was that he had asked him to meet Ramana Maharishi in Raman Kendra, and he went, of course, he couldn't do it, and Jung fell ill in India. But there was a reply that Jung gave, which I'll not go into. The other aspect which I wanted to ask was this question of Souza in a social gathering or a party, plonking himself in a corner on a table and sketching. You mentioned that. I want to mention that we now have evidence, more than the examples I have at least, some evidence and an eyewitness account, where not only did he plonk himself and sketch, but he also discarded those sketches. He did discard those sketches, and it's very interesting. And what the fate that befell those discarded sketches, we do not know. But this was actually, endorsed by Krishan Khanna in a private conversation with me. Thank you.
All right. So should we look at more images, or we can?
Sure.
We can look at more paintings.
Oh,
Yeah.
you want to? Okay.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
This is a theme that interested Annapurna very much in the book, and she asked me.
Please use your mic.
Yeah, these two images. Oh, she asked me to juxtapose these two images. So that's a sketch by Souza, and this is Mother Mary. It is there's a special name given to this called the Illusa icon, which is a pose cheek to cheek with Christ. When you're touching your cheek, it's called the Illusa icon. And then it has another term attached to it, which is called the Vladimir Illusa icon, which means perpetual virgin. That she was a perpetual virgin. She was a virgin before she gave birth, during, and after. So that's how she is regarded in Christianity. And there's these Gospels by Matthew and Luke and Odes of Solomon, which all emphasize this. So Mary is compromised by her maternal instinct and virginity. And what Souza does to that, he's a Catholic. He grew up with these images in his childhood, right? There's this film that we have made, a 20-minute film called Ruptured Lines. And in that, there's a shot in a church, in a Goan church. There's a woman who's acting as his mother, though we never show her face or anything. And she sits and she's got her hands like this. And then there's this little boy sitting next to her who's also folded his hands the way his mother has. And they're praying, because it's an everyday ritual to go to church and pray. And then the camera shifts to all the images on the walls of that church. So there's Christ with thorns and Mary, and then there's the Pietà. Lots of images to do with sin and blood and repentance and salvation. When I looked at that image of that sketch, so that's a mother, and the mother is caring and nurturing and a nourishing mother, but being a mother, she's not given up on her sensuality and sexuality and other aspects of her personality. She's a whole woman. She holds on to every part of her psyche.
There's a beautiful Yashoda Krishna bronze at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it's gorgeous. You can go on their website and see it. And it's, I think it's a Vijayanagara era bronze. And it's frontal as opposed to this image, which is on the side. But I wrote about it. I forgot where I wrote about it. But it's so fascinating because her nipples are erect. And Krishna is sitting there and he's touching it. And there's just this whole vast realm of Leela, of play that's captured in that, psychological and bodily play that's captured in that bronze, that this particular image, I think also is able to grasp. That things are not so linear. The body is not fully under anyone's control. It has its own logic and its own energy, which guides sometimes the mind and sometimes guides it away. Would you like to, you want to read? Please, please, please.
This is a quote by Carlo. Mary is elevated to the status of a goddess and consequently loses, I have to hold this.
Yes, please.
Hold it like this.
Yes.
Mary is elevated to the status of a goddess and consequently loses something of her humanity. She will not conceive her child in sin like all other mothers, and therefore he also will not be a human being but a god. To my knowledge, at least, the incarnation was only partially consummated. Both mother and son are not real human beings at all, but gods. This arrangement, though it had the effect of exalting Mary's personality in the masculine sense by bringing it closer to the perfection of Christ, was at the same time injurious to the feminine principle. Thus, the more the feminine ideal is bent in the direction of the masculine, a masculine striving for perfection, and there is only turning back, a collapse of the ideal, which could easily have been avoided by paying attention to the feminine ideal of completeness. And despite all the recognition and glorification of the feminine principle, this never prevailed against the patriarchal supremacy. We have not, therefore, by any means heard the last of it. So this is a quote by Carl Jung, and I put it together with these images. Yeah. And then I ended with, this is where Souza, raised a Catholic Christian, becomes ambivalent about religion and restores the feminine principle in his art practice in bold, dark lines. Yeah.
Any more questions? How is our time?
Yeah.
5 more minutes. Would you like to show some more images?
Okay.
Yeah?
Let's see if we have. What do we have after this? What happened? Now you must talk about this.
Well, I really asked her to put this together because I was interested in the animal quality. He would have been familiar with yoginis and goddesses with animal qualities. There are images, sculptures in Goa that are of this sort, but also the fact that her pudendum is a lamp and it's burning. It's not a unlit lamp. It's a lit lamp. It's fire and heat.
Yeah.
And the vividness of the red.
Energy.
When does this image date from?
So this is 1966, the Red Goddess.
So it's 1966, and it's very, very strong imagery. And in 1962, he makes this image of a woman, and it's hearkening an era that's about to come. We can imagine the hippies that are coming to Goa. We can see it. And this is, in some sense for me, the way that imaginations get ahead of their times and predict the future that is around the corner. And in this image, you have this gorgeous pornographic, yakshi, like women on the beach, all these things, and that funky swastika around her neck and a chain necklace. And the eyes, like, you know, it could be like, maybe he was seeing Brigitte Bardot or somebody like that, you know, with a lot of that heavy-duty false eyelashes and mascara. Like, it's just very, very complex. Like, he's taken his strong women wherever he can get them and putting them all together to create the woman of his canvas, right? And I found this very beautiful. Could we go to the next image if there's another one?
And these women, you know, like they stand ironic and sarcastic to the sexual union, and the exaggerated emphasis laid on physical intercourse, which Dora Marsden termed it as more absurd than wicked.
I love these paintings. This is from 1941, and this is a Goan landscape.
42, yeah.
From 1942.
Rice paddy.
Rice paddies. And I've just been looking at Hiroshige. There's a show at the British Museum of Hiroshige, and Utagawa Hiroshige. And, you know, he inaugurated a way of looking at the landscape as you're moving through it, which is unique even in Japanese art. And then, of course, it's very impactful on people like Van Gogh as he looks at Provence. And I see in this image the movement of someone like Hiroshige via Van Gogh and the Impression and Fauvists and Impressionists and all these people, and arriving at Souza's door. For him to see his beautiful Goa through a Japanese artist and a Provençalian artist, I don't know how to say that in French, and then arriving to look at this landscape. And it's such a gorgeous, gorgeous drawing. It's so full of life and vividness. Yeah. And it's a happy Souza you get here. And it's a Souza in love with the land. And he says that actually in his writing, that he loves Goa. He loves what it gives him. He exiled himself to London and to Paris, but he exiled himself from the art world here, not from Goa. And I think that that's something very important to hold on to as we look at an image like this. Is our time up? All right, any more questions before we wrap it up for the evening? Right. Thank you so much, Janeita, for allowing me to enter your work.
Thank you so
It's a
much,
privilege.
Annapurna. It's such an honor to have you here with me. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, all of you, for being here. It's been wonderful.
Thank you to everyone.
The book from today's session is available for purchase and author signing right outside. Good night.
Are you happy with how it went?
Yeah, very, yeah.
Very good.
So intrigued by your questions, yeah, and it really made me think, but it just came together, right?
Yeah, but that's the point, right? Like to keep it